Thank you. Well, this is wonderful, looking out at a live audience tonight. Now, just so you know, we're splitting the time with the Zoom audience. There's about 120 folks here. There's 270, 280 folks on Zoom, so that's almost 400. I was told 3 different countries, and I don't know whether 27 different states or something like that are tuning in tonight, so they're putting you to work. Welcome to the second Crowley lecture of the 2021-2022 year. I'd like to, before I introduce her, and we have a great duo tonight, before I introduce them, I'd like to just take a look for 1 minute in the rearview mirror and talk about September 18th. For those of you that weren't able to make it, we had a really banner day for the Museum of Newport Irish History on September 18th. We were able to dedicate the historical sign at the Barney Street Cemetery through the generosity of Carol Lepley and her family. There's a beautiful historical sign now at the Barney Street Cemetery. It was a classic fall, beautiful day, just completely clear and crisp. The sign is there. And for those of you that haven't been to the Barney Street Cemetery, I encourage you to do that. And I'm going to very quickly give you the directions. It's right behind the Newport Historical Society. Drive up Toro Street. Just before you get to the fire station, the Flatiron Fire Station, turn left on Mount Vernon. 1 block in, there's the Barney Street Cemetery. It's a beautiful sanctuary in the middle of that neighborhood, and you have to see the sign. You must see the sign. It's really beautiful, a great touch to the neighborhood. And following the dedication of the sign at Barney Street, we adjourned to Hibernian Hall. We were able to honor and give our thanks to board members Peter Martin and Jack Curran, both here in the front row for their more than 25 years of combined service to the board, service and advice. So just one of those wonderful days. Food was prepared very nicely by Kathleen Path and her daughter Caitlin. Prepared it, served it. Everyone had a nice time. Music provided by Tim May. Thanks, Tim. And it was just a really nice afternoon. Looking ahead now for a second. Sunday, the 31st of October is our final day at the Interpretive Center for this season. We're closing down, and Enzo, I think you told me that I know the attendance has been on par with other years despite COVID, and donations also on par, maybe even up a little bit. So it was worked out a great season while working under about 50% of the docents. Just due to COVID and other reasons, we were working with a kind of a skeleton crew that carried us through the whole season. So another great season. Thanks, Enzo. And thanks to all the docents, a lot of whom are in the room here. November 15th is the next lecture. Dr. Deborah Mulligan, and she is in the room someplace, and I haven't met her yet. Can you raise your hand? Great. Yeah, this is going to be another intriguing lecture. She's going to talk about the political life of James Howard McGrath. I don't know how. See, some of you know the story. Sure, the gentleman who became governor of the state in the 1940s and the 1950s, left the office of Attorney General in disgrace, and I'll leave it there so that you can entertain us on November 15th. But nice to have you with us tonight. Saturday, 11 December, we will have our Christmas open house at the Interpretive Center, and we're going to showcase this year. We'll have going the loop of the oral histories of the Irish families, and several of the people are in the room here. I think Mary Ellen Atkins is with us. I did see Phil Driscoll, Jack Curran, Ann May are some of the people whose stories of growing up in an Irish family are on the wall there, and it'll be very, it'll be entertaining, along with men's Hibernian singers, Christmas cookies, a little eggnog with or without. It'll be another fun day. That only that much? Okay. I'll remember that. Tonight's lecture is underwritten by the generosity of Peter Martin. Just wanted you to know that we've been very, very fortunate. Very fortunate to be able to bring you these fine lectures through the generosity of so many people. And it's working out well, and I thank you sincerely, Peter. Now, as I introduce tonight's speakers, Dr. Margaret Lynch-Brennan over here, Leslie Hogan sitting here, Leslie Jones, I'm sorry. And this is one of the first times I don't like to read bios. In this case, at some point here, I'm going to have to pick up and read because it has words in there that I didn't even understand in some cases. So I'll leave it at that. Dr. Brennan is not only an author, but she taught every level of education in the New York school system, from elementary to secondary, to high school, to college, to postgraduate. She retired after more than 30 years in the system, right?
That's right.
Just recently, or I didn't see you?
A long time ago.
Okay, all right. She was educated, received her PhD at the University of New York at Albany. She has lectured throughout the world, many, many countries. And I found this very interesting that you were also worked as a conservator at the Tenement Museum. And,
Actually, was a consultant with them.
Great. Yeah, so did you work with Ed O'Donnell? Was he part of that too?
He was before me.
Oh, he was, okay, yeah.
Yep,
Yeah, I've had a couple. I always say, every time we go to New York, we stop at the Tenement Museum. It's just world class, isn't it? It really is, and thank you. And next, Leslie Jones, and here's where she's the Director of Museum Affairs and the Chief Curator of for the Preservation Society of Newport, where she does it all right now. And I mean all, is that right? Job description here. She oversees curatorial conservation, collections management, site stewardship, exhibitions, interpretation, the annual Research Fellows Program, and public programs. How about that? That's great. A varied background in all things related, and yes. In all things related to museums and curatorship. She was educated at the University of Miami, Ohio. And interestingly, masters from Smithsonian in concert with Corcoran School of Art in Washington, D.C., as well as New York University. And a couple different things there. But great to have you with us. And I'm going to turn it over at this juncture. Dr. Mark, great to have you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me without static? Do I sound okay? Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I really appreciate it. Just want you to know that what I'm going to do is give you an overview of what life would have been like for an Irish Bridget in the period 1840 to 1930. And my colleague, Leslie B. Jones, is going to talk specifically about the Irish maids who lived and worked in Newport. Okay? So let's see. Shemale moho ilamar, shemo hezer ilamar, niwur sein sona shein, again mo ilamar. Now, why did I just sing you an Irish language lament? I sang it because in the 19th century, the employing woman of servants in the private home was called the mistress. Well, it was written about them. The mistress described their Irish Bridgets as singing sad ditties as they go about their work. So I thought it was appropriate to start with a sad ditty that might give you an idea of how they might have felt, newcomers in this country. Now, I know you probably cannot read the caption here. I'll go forward to so you can read the caption, but this is typical of the Bridget cartoons. This one is from 1867 from Harper's Weekly. You see, not only in popular literature like Harper's Bazaar or Peterson's or Ladies Goldie's book, there were many articles making fun of the Irish Bridget, or they called her Biddy, the diminutive of Bridget. Because of her ignorance, what they thought was her ignorance of American household methods, how to take care of a good house. So let's see what this one is all about. Okay, we're going to next slide. The title of this had been exceedingly clever, and the mistress had said, "Bridget, I told you to boil the eggs soft, and they're quite hard." And Bridget said, "Soft as in them, why I've been boiling this hour, and the water won't get them soft anyhow." So we say, ha, 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 silly Bridget, silly, silly Bridget. Not really. You see, there was some logic to Bridget's mistake, because in Ireland, and if any time I lose, I go somewhere my voice doesn't carry, just raise your hand. Be like when I was a teacher, I would tell kids, raise your hand if you can't hear me or if I'm going too fast. They always did too. There was logic to her mistake, because the Irish Bridget probably had been raised on a diet of boiled potatoes in Ireland. In fact, just how many potatoes the Irish people ate prior to the famine is quite astounding. We have data from Ireland in the 1830s that indicates that Irish men ate nearly 13 pounds of potatoes per person per day, and Irish women 10 pounds. And how did they cook those potatoes? They boiled them. And what happens when you boil potatoes? They get soft. So you see, Bridget wasn't quite as ignorant as people might have thought. Indeed, yes. By the way, as surprisingly as it may sound, that was an excellent diet for the Irish. Potatoes, along with the buttermilk that they drank, and a little bit of cabbage, a little bit of turnips. Are we getting feedback? Okay, can I move back? Is that what you're like? No, keep going. That was a very nutritious diet. Observers always commented that the poor Irish people before the famine really looked better nourished than poor people in England. So it was a pretty good diet. So who were the Irish Bridgets referenced in this cartoon? Well, what you have to keep in mind is that domestic service was the #1 occupation, paid occupation, of women in both Ireland and in the United States in the 19th century. So that's important to keep in mind, okay? And Irish women dominated this position in the urban Northeast of America between 1840 and 1930. So I'm saying domestic service, well, what does that mean? Basically, it means people who worked as maids, chambermaids, waitresses, cooks, child nurses. Anybody want to hazard a guess as what we might call child nurses today? Nannies, exactly. And these people, the ones that I researched, lived in the homes where they worked, okay? So close was the association between the Irish and working in domestic service that the scholar Blaine McKinley said, quote, "After 1850, domestic servants and the Irish became virtually synonymous," end quote. And so close was the association between the actual name Bridget and working in domestic service that some Irish girls named Bridget, who came to the United States to work in domestic service, changed their names when they got here. For example, in 1923, Bridget McGinn, who came from County Donegal, came to work in Boston, and her aunts insisted that she change her name to Bertha because of people made fun of Biddy, Biddy's day off, Biddy's this, whatever. And just keep in mind now, St. Bridget, as you probably know, is second only to St. Patrick in the Trinity of Saints in Ireland, and St. Columkill is third. So the three top ones. You wouldn't have known that when I was growing up in an Irish-American enclave in the 1950s, because I knew no one named Bridget. I think the association was still in people's minds. Now, however, I'm delighted with all the Bridgets that I now meet, people's nieces, grandnieces, and so on. But that's what it dates to. Put that name away, it means domestic service. Well, when Bridget McGinn was interviewed late in her life about what her life had been like as an Irish domestic, she was asked the question, "What do you think about the name change?" She said, "Oh, quote, I wish I never did have it changed because I like Bridget," end quote. Well, I'll tell you, I do too. I think it's a very pretty name. It was very, very common in the urban Northeast of America for individual families to hire a servant. But here's the key thing. Servants, and it served as a status symbol for people if they could have servants. If they employed servants, most households had one servant. And she was called the proverbial maid of all work or the sole servant in a house. One person in the house who was expected to all the cooking, all the cleaning, childcare may have been added to that too, ironing, laundry, everything, okay? Very different from the situation that my colleague, Leslie B. Jones, is going to talk about in Newport Mansions. That would have been the dream of an Irish girl. Work in a big house with a big staff, all the jobs cut by the number of people employed, and the pay was better too. So that would have been a good shot to get. Okay. What you're looking at is a photo of Ellen O'Loughlin, who came from Broadford in County Clare in 1893 at the age of 14. She came to work as a servant in the greater Troy, New York area. I am always moved by this picture because of how young she was, okay, when she came to the United States. And this is a key thing you have to keep in mind about the Irish Bridgets. They were very young and most were unmarried. In fact, the median age, scholars have told us, between 1850 and 1921 was age 21. So while Ellen here at 14 was on the lower end of the spectrum, there were lots of other girls who were younger than 16 who came over. So most of the Irish Bridgets were young and unmarried, and you have to remember something else that distinguished their situation from that of Irish immigrant men. These girls would have lived in the house of the employer where they worked. That means they did not live with the Irish community. Now, an Irish man might have come over and he might have boarded with a woman who took in boarders, and he might have had great access to the Irish community. Might have been a couple other fellows from his work who also lived in the same house, lived nearby. Not so for the young Irish girls. They would have lived in with strangers. And if you were the sole maid of all work, you were it. You had no one to so-called hang out with. Huh? And they did all the work. They had a very, very long work day. It was considered the longest work day of employed women. It was generally 10 to 12 hours per day. Long work day, okay. It was a very long work week too. Generally, it was a 7 day a week job. Generally, the time off would have been limited to Thursday evenings and maybe a Sunday afternoon off. And if you check on the history of any Irish organizations, you'll find out that they tended to have dances or any kind of social activities on Thursday nights because Thursday night was the maid's night out. Anyway, it was a long work week. It was a long work day, limited time off. It provided a very lonely introduction to Irish girls newly arrived in America. So I don't think it's any wonder that they were known for singing sad songs as they went about their work. Now, next we're going to take a look at Hannah Collins. Hannah immigrated from Ballinlough in Lepp in County Cork to Elmira, New York in 1895. She found working as a maid of all work to be very hard work. In 1898, she wrote to her friend and fellow Irish domestic, Nora McCarthy, that quote, "I hope someday will come when I won't have to work so hard. I do hate to get up every morning. I am so tired," end quote. Now take a good look at Hannah. Does Hannah look like Ellen? Is there any kind of just word that you would use to describe how Hannah looks to me? To you? She looks mature. She really wasn't. She was only about, I think she was 18 at that time. Does she look sweet and meek and mild? No, she doesn't. She's kind of assertive, doesn't she? Well, you know, the Irish Bridgets were known for their assertiveness. Employers complained that the Irish Bridgets did not know their place. They said that the Irish Bridgets were impotent, insolent, and defiant. And they complained that the Irish Bridgets demanded all her evenings out, and when told to be in by 10 o'clock, came in at midnight instead. Now, what are we looking at here? You're looking at the third floor servant quarters at Lindenwold, which is the Kinderhook, New York home of former President Martin Van Buren. And what you're looking at is where his Irish servants lived. Yeah, doesn't look too lovely, does it? Now, if you took the tour of Lindenwold and then we went upstairs, in the past, this was not part of the tour, but it is now. I worked with them as a consultant. Anyway, this is in such, the quarters the maids had stood in such complete contrast to the family rooms below. They were beautiful and elegantly, you know, supported with furniture and so on. But most girls who came to America to work as Irish maids did not live in living quarters. Instead, they lived in spaces like this. They might have lived in attics, which were oftentimes cold in the winter and hot in the summer. And as running water came in the 19th century, some families chose not to have the running water go all the way up to the 3rd floor where the maids worked. So they might have had to carry water up to keep themselves clean. Was not easy. And also some, like child nurses, didn't even get a room by themselves. They actually had to share a room with the child that they took care of. Now, in contrast, at least if you, well, you might have thought this is good or bad. If you worked in a house with a large staff, you may have had to share your room with other members of the staff. And if you liked them, that might have been good. If you didn't like them, that might not have been good. So depend on that. But, you know, when scholars took a look at domestic service in the United States during this period, they said, you know, in a lot of ways, this was kind of a good job for immigrant girls. Why would they say that? Well, they said, first of all, they got a roof over their head. That's room, okay? And they got food. In addition to the room and board, they got a salary, which meant that since their room and board was taken care of, they could save some of their wages, right? As I said, the room might have been less than desirable, and sometimes the food was too, depending on the house in which you lived. I've read about people getting scraps from the family's table and things like that. Other people, you know, employers ran the gamut from wonderful people, who took great care of the people in their house, to awful people, because isn't that human nature? You've got wonderful people and terrible people. A lot of them met them all. Now, it's interesting. When I do presentations, people always want to know. They have 2 questions that they always ask me. So I started putting it in my presentation. You want to say, you just want to know, well, what kind of money did they make? Well, to give you an idea of the kind of money that they would have made as a domestic. In 1845, in New York City, an inexperienced maid of all work, so a greenhorn, somebody who's new, would have gotten between $5 and $6 a month, which in 2015 American dollars would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $160 a month. By 1916, live-in maids were said to have made about $20 a month, which again, if you transport that into 2015 dollars, is roughly $450 a month. So generally, the wages paid to domestic servants varied by geographic location. Cities you would have gotten a better pay in a city, obviously, than you would have in the country. And it also depended on what kind of job you did. Specialized servants, like the servants who would have worked in the Newport Mansions, would have gotten better money. And generally, if there was a cook employed and one servant, the cook generally was the highest paid in a house. Lucy Maynard Salmon wrote a book called Domestic Service at the end of the 19th century. And what she had done was she surveyed domestics in the Boston area, and she compared their wages to that of teachers in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And she said when she did the comparison, it turned out that although, of course, the teachers' salaries were higher, the maids were actually making more money. And she came to that conclusion because she said, since the Irish girls, the Bridgets, lived in the house, they didn't have some of the expenses the teachers had. Among the expenses teachers had that live-in servants would not have would have been housing. See, they had a roof over their head, food. They would have had to pay for their own food, teachers would have. Teachers would have had to pay trolley fare or car fare somehow to get to school and back. They had to have clothing appropriate to teaching in the schools. They had to pay for clothing. And this is not new and still happens today. As a former teacher, I can tell you, they would have had to pay for some teaching supplies out of their own pockets too. Yeah. But the Irish Bridgets, as I said, got room and board so they could save some of their money. So people always say, well, what do they do with their money? Well, the Irish girls, like most Irish immigrant people, sent money home to Ireland. The money they sent from America, they called remittances. When it got to Ireland, because it came from America, it was known as American money. And American money did a world of good for Ireland at the end of in the 19th century, from 1850 right through about 1920. Yeah. What did that money do? Well, if they sent the money home for Ireland, one of the things the money might have been used for was the education of younger siblings. To understand what I mean by that, you have to understand that in Ireland, secondary education was not free until the 1960s, 1960, that's 1960s. What was free was what they called their system of national schools. And the system of national schools was generally what we would think like K-8 education ended when you were around 13. But if you wanted somebody in the family to go beyond that, you had to pay. They had to go into a town and the girls would go to a convent school, the boys might go to the Irish Christian Brothers. So somebody had to pay for that, and if the family had no means, the money they got from America might have helped. The other thing that they did was their money was a great avid supporter of the building of the Catholic Church edifice here in the United States, and some of that money went back to Ireland for the same purpose. You scratch an Irish parish that was formed after 1850 in this country, somewhere between 1850 and 1920, and you talk to the pastor and you will find out among the biggest donors to building that edifice were the Irish domestics in that area. Very much devoted to the church. What else did they spend their money on? Well, they liked nice clothes. I think that's wonderful. In fact, in 1906, when they were speaking specifically about Irish domestics, they said, the average domestic worker spends most of her week's wages on dress. Criticized for the love of fashion, if I'm the mistress and my maid looks just like I do. There's something wrong with that? Crossing class lines here, huh? Yeah. So, all right. So sometimes they run ads like this. A good woman wanted to take care of a boy. The key thing is positively no Irish need apply. Why didn't they want any Irish? Well, because they really wanted native-born white girls to come and work for them. But native-born white girls wanted no part of domestic service. It was considered low-status work that stigmatized the worker. No part of that, thank you very much. You have to remember that race and ethnicity would have interacted or intersected with this as well, because the Irish were originally seen as a separate race, not an ethnic group, as the Celts. And you have to keep in mind, and this is important and many people forget it, the Irish were the first non-Anglo-Saxons to come to the United States in large numbers, willingly. Obviously, African Americans came here before that, but they came unwillingly. Religion factored into it as well, because in the mid-19th century, it was believed that to be American was synonymous with being a Protestant. And many Protestants did not consider Catholics to be Christians. As the historian John Hyam said, quote, anti-Catholic nativism completely overshadowed every other nativist tradition. So now you're looking at Nora McCarthy. She's the one on my right, your left, and her friend, Mary Hayes. Now, despite how difficult it was, the Irish girls did construct social lives for themselves. As part of her social life, Nora would visit friends in the greater Bradford area, and she also kept up a lively correspondence with her family and friends in Ireland. Other Irish Bridgets, as part of their social life, went to the Irish dances. The Irish county associations were famous for having dances on Thursday nights, so that young Irish men and young Irish women could meet one another. But religion was a big factor in the social life. And before he said anything, how in God's name could religion be a part of that? Isn't it today? Don't people get out there on the steps of a church, a synagogue, a temple, anywhere? Don't they meet their friends and talk about what's new before and after the service? Well, the Irish girls not only could find out what was going on in the Irish community, remember, they did not live in the Irish community. They could find out who was new, who'd had a baby, who was getting married, all the good news. And on top of that, they could wear their nice clothes. Had a nice figure when everybody looked good when they used to go to church. Right. So, in fact, the Newport servants, I heard, were famous for going to the 40 steps and Cliff Walk to dance and laugh and step dances. Yeah, okay. Now back to Nora, I just wanted you to know that she was very typical of Irish people in that she followed two of her elder sisters to the Haverhill Bradford area of Massachusetts. That's what we call a chain migration. One person comes over, gets a job. Okay. They would get a little money, sent for somebody else, friend or relative, come over. So that by the end of this whole chain across the Atlantic, you can have a portion of a town in Ireland transported to a portion of one town in America. That's why when you look at the backgrounds of certain towns, just say, oh, these people came from Derry, or all these people came from Limerick. It's because they probably had a chain across the Atlantic. Nora was typical of most Irish women in that she married an Irish man. The Irish are famous for their endogamy, that means marrying within the same group, through to the 20th century. She was also typical in that when she married, she did not work outside the house for wages after she married, but she did help augment the family income. Would anyone like to hazard guesses how she might have helped without leaving the house? How could she have augmented help with the family income? Borders, she took in borders. Yes, exactly. So she's typical of that. Right? Well, and so I maintain that the Irish became more acceptable to middle-class Americans due in no small part to the influence of the Irish Bridget, who was probably the only representative of the Irish with whom Americans would have had personal and direct ongoing contact. They were not likely to have had such contact with Irish men. In service, Irish girls are said to have learned the manners and mores of middle-class Americans. Scholars say they were acculturated. And when they had families, they are said to have inculcated in their families these middle-class manners and mores that they learned in service: how to set the right table, how to speak properly, how to dress properly. All those things they taught their families. So I believe the Irish Bridget was crucial to Irish upward mobility in the United States. The other reason I wrote this is Irish immigration is very different from the subsequent Jewish and Italian and Greek immigrations. Jewish families tended to come in family groups. Greeks and Italians came in a mostly male migration. Not until they decided to permanently settle in the United States would they send back to Italy or to Greece for a wife or a fiancé. Unlike that, the Irish immigration was heavily female. Lots and lots of females in that immigrant stream. And yet, most histories of the Irish still focus on Irish men. So that is why I wrote this book, and I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Peggy. That was wonderful. And thankfully we haven't overlapped too much, but you did bring up a couple of points I'm excited to share with the audience. So nice to see you all this evening. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you, both here as well as our friends on Zoom, giving you a nice big warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be joining the Museum of Newport Irish Heritage's Crowley Lecture Series. And I'm happy to share with you this evening some insight into the research the Preservation Society has conducted on the lives and livelihood of domestic staff at our various historic properties. We have focused mostly on the Elms. There's actually a tour that we have developed called the Servant Life Tour that's available twice daily. And that has focused both not only on Irish women, but also the other individuals who we know to have worked at the Elms. And most of this research I'm sharing, there's a few new things I'm adding to it, but I want to extend and acknowledge my thanks to the work of John Church, Paul Miller, and Holly Collins, who started this project many years ago. So to get started. So pictured here from left to right is 3 individuals who were employed by the Elms, I should say by the Berwins for the Elms, which is a historic house on Bellevue Avenue here in Newport. On the left, we have Julia Lynch-Sullivan, who was employed as a laundress. Next to her is her husband, Timothy Sullivan, an assistant gardener. And to the right is Nellie Lynch, a chambermaid and Julia's sister, and the reason why Julia made her way to Newport. Julia and Nellie were among 8 siblings who are from Cork, Ireland. And while we're not entirely sure who arrived first, per what Peggy was saying, we do know they arrived separately, and Julia did come to the US in 1923, landing in New York. Somehow she found employment. We're not quite sure what that employment was or for who it was, but it certainly gave her the stance she needed to join her sister eventually in Newport. So what we do know is the summer of 1927, Julia reunited with Nellie in Newport. Nellie had already been working for the Berwins at the Elms. We're not entirely sure what her position was there, but eventually she was a chambermaid. The reason why she may have come to the Elms could have been through reference through an intelligence office or from her sister giving her a solid recommendation. On the left, what we have is an October 9th, 1927 letter written by the secretary managing housekeeper for the Elms. And it reads, because it took me a while to decipher this, I'll read it for you. Julia Lynch has been with Ms. Julia A. Berwin as second laundress for the last 4 months, and I must highly recommend her. She has given entire satisfaction during that time, is an unusually nice girl, neat, willing, honest, etc. And she leaves to return to her former situation. As it's not addressed to anyone in particular, we assume it's a reference letter. It could also have been for the housemaid to remember that Julia was a well-known and well-respected member of the household, because it's important for us to keep in mind that the Newport Mansions, for the most part, were built as just summer residences, occupied for just about 6 weeks a year. So this isn't a job that you would take and live in the house for the entire year for many years. A lot of people migrated for these positions. So at this time, the positions of second laundress for Julia and a chambermaid for Nellie were entirely expected. Women, particularly women of Irish heritage or citizenship, performed more behind the scenes tasks in the Newport Mansions, but they are vital to the running of the household, particularly if they were to be at the standard of the Berwins. So the letter on the right is dated October 10th, 1957. I have not been able to decipher the entire thing yet, but some of the key takeaway points is that she's now Mrs. Julia Sullivan, no longer Julia Lynch. So she had married Timothy the gardener, and it states that Julia had been laundress for 18 summer seasons at the Elms. So if you're doing the math with me, it would suggest that she arrived at the Elms around 1939, but obviously our letter on the left disproves that, as it says 1927. So this is sort of a window into the kinds of contradictory information we find as a part of the research process, but thankfully with primary documents, we can correct some of the errors. And it could be also that Julia took a couple summers off and worked somewhere else, or had to take a summer off to care for a new child. So we just like to keep all those things in mind when we're researching these stories. We also came to find out that later on she goes from second laundress to just laundress. So obviously she was promoted along her time period that she was there. So what else do we know about Julia and that of her sister Nellie? So as staff, a servant generally had one afternoon and evening a week off. Work days began as early as 7 and continued until around 9, even to 11 o'clock at night. That all depended on if the Berwins were entertaining. During the day, the staff was at work in their assigned places, footmen at the door, helping in the butler's pantry, maids in their assigned bedrooms, but kitchen and laundry staff really never ventured outside into any of the public spaces, which I'll get into a little bit further. In their personal lives, we know that Julia, on the right, of course, met her husband at the Elms, which was not too uncommon for domestic service. They were married in 1931. Nellie, however, met her husband a slightly different way. She took time off to work at the torpedo factory on Goat Island and met her husband there, who was Italian, actually. Let's see. So we also believe that Nellie may have left her work at the Elms around the time that she got married, which was around World War II. Julia continued to work, as we know from the letter from 1957 up until that time period, and that's when the house closes. Ms. Berwin, who was the owner of the home, died 4 years later at age 91, so that was the last season that she occupied the house before she passed away. And we do know that eventually Julia was also responsible for hiring all the women who would clean the house during the season, so she had the title of laundress, but she did a lot more than just that. So why she didn't receive a promotion is still something we're unsure of. They were both Catholic, very dedicated to St. Mary's Church. I should mention also that Julia is here on the left in quite an interesting costume. And on the right, she's also with some of her other friends and fellow staff members from the Elms. They were in Newport at a time that the Irish community in Rhode Island was thriving. We also know that there are some personal elements of their lives that are missing, but their family members have stepped forward on many occasions to do oral history. So we've been very grateful to them for all of the background information that they have been able to provide. Unfortunately, there's just not that much that stands in recollection. What we do know from a general understanding about domestic staff, not just for Julia and Nellie, but for others who were in the area, as Peggy mentioned, the 40 Steps was quite a happening place to hang out. There was dancing and music and picnics, and that's actually where we know that Timothy courted Julia. So it's a very special place for them. Omnibuses led by horses and later motorized buses would also transport staff members to Easton's Beach on their days off. There were a lot of card games played in the kitchen, and relationships between various culture groups became strong as a means of finding community in what was essentially a foreign country, which most of these individuals came to for the purpose of opportunity. So, of course, to come by such employment opportunities in domestic service, there was a long established process, and we usually went through what's called an intelligence office. I don't mean spies or undercover agents or even private investigators. To the contrary, if anything, the intelligence office culture was not always viewed as reliable. It was, however, the system dedicated to placing household staff in domestic situations in the US. And so while not all employers were pleased with what an intelligence office eventually provided in terms of staff caliber, they were a time-saving resource. Otherwise, a head of household who didn't want to have to write up advertisements, be placed in newspaper, answering all the phone calls that came in, even knocks at the door. The intelligence office took that off of their plate. And at the peak of the American domestic staff timeline, it came in 1880. And with household workers, they increased nearly 500,000 people in 1 year alone. So there was a demand, and there was also a supply meeting that demand. So they kept databases of qualified people. It was a non-binding kind of agreement between individuals who were seeking employment or those who were seeking employees. They did not have any kind of contracts or guarantees. You paid a subscription service in order to receive, to be basically kept on their mailing list or to reach out to them in times of need, which in some ways, I guess that facilitates keeping that subscription, because if you keep having failure after failure, you're going to need more and more people to replenish that staff. And those databases would incorporate people's employment history, their references, and their skills. Actually, thanks to research that Peggy took on, we're also aware that not all of those references were actually factual, and intelligence offices were known to doctor or improve references, even forge them. So, and some staff members even sold their references for quite a penny. So there was a business behind the business. This is a clip from a Newport newspaper, the Newport Daily News in 1903, and these are some of the employment or intelligence offices that we know to have existed. These are more clips from other period papers, examples of advertisements from New York, which we know people like the Berwins would have been citing because of their primary residence in Manhattan. So just as a reference here, looking at this clip right here, wanted a German girl, a situation in a private family. She's a good cook and is willing to do general housework. And that immigration and immigrant community was pivotal and important to the intelligence office and to what they're able to provide. So this is a list of some of the known intelligence offices just here in Newport, and these are all from digitized historic newspapers. This is roughly from 1850 to 1906. And what you'll notice is that many of them have very strong cultural affiliations within their own names. And that is not by mistake, that is by design. The hierarchy and acceptance of workers in private household was laid out by gender, citizenship status, and country of origin. So recognizing a name with cultural familiarity was helpful to those seeking employment and those seeking employees. So while posting in a newspaper would be reliable as a way of finding an office that could in turn find employment opportunities, not all intelligence offices we know use newspapers to advertise themselves. They did rely quite a bit on basically sharing information through conversation. And that's because not everyone that could work was literate. So we have to keep that in mind as well. So word of mouth was vital. And also for those who were seeking employees, it did offer a bit of discretion if they weren't necessarily listed in a newspaper. You'll probably notice missing on this was a name that was part of the marketing for this program, which was Bridget McGinn. We do know that she had an intelligence office on Spring Street, actually right behind the Elms, but she did not advertise publicly. But like many of her peers, she probably was responsible for the placing of many men and women of Irish heritage. So these are various members of the Elms staff over the years, with Julia and Nellie featured on the right. While peaks of immigration in Irish, Swedish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, all to the United States, do help paint pictures of what was going on in American domestic service at the time, the trends we see in individual house record keeping actually relate more to what kind of work specific nationalities were generally given in domestic work, and there was a hierarchy. So Julia and Nellie were two of many Irish women who worked for the Berwin family over the years. They had quite a bit of turnover. In the 1915 census from the Berwin's house in New York City, they had 4 Irish alien women employed by the Berwins. Delia Smith, Margaret Mulligan, Sarah Dwyer, and Catherine Smith were all maids. And for context, there were 12 people listed in that census, and those included also 2 Englishmen, one French chef, one Scottish, one Swedish, and one Finnish. So while there were mixes of cultural backgrounds in one household, there was a pattern as to what work was performed by which groups of people. It was desirable for chefs to be French and for butlers and housekeepers to be English. And that was mostly because those were the individuals who would likely interact with guests and also the heads of the household. So underappreciated and more labor-intensive tasks were largely reserved for Irish women within the house. And Nellie and Julia would not be seen in these parts of the house. We have the Elms dining room at the top left, and then the transverse cross hallway, as well, of course, the beautiful gardens and grounds in the backdrop. This would be more their realm of living as well as working. So at the top left, we have the staff staircase that goes from the ground floor all the way up to the third floor. Technically, there are 4 flights of stairs. And they're very steep if you've ever experienced them. They're not designed for ease of access. Just below that, we have an outline of the floor plan for the third floor, technically, that were the staff bedrooms and bathrooms. And then on the right, of course, we have an example of one of the many linen closets that both Nellie and Julia would have frequented as laundress and chambermaid. And then this was also one of the inventory pages that was found in these closets when the Preservation Society acquired the property. And the architect of the building, Horst Trumbauer, took the spatial separation of staff very seriously. And in the development of the Elms, he copied a lot of 18th century designs, but he built a house around 20th century social constructs. So these are living accommodations, examples of them at least, at the Elms. They were always considered very generous, and there were movements in the 1880s and 1890s to better the conditions for domestic workers. We like to think that the Berwins were somewhat good at that, but we'll get to that subject also. They weren't angels, of course. We do know that descendants of Julia and Nellie were interviewed as part of the oral history that I'd mentioned, and they share that, quote, when Nellie was working there, she had a lovely bedroom on the 3rd floor. Bill had very nice bedrooms, and her room had a beautiful bureau with all kinds of little perfumes. Now, this is the recollection of when this person was a child, so it may have looked a lot nicer to her, but not so nice to Nellie. Oops, so I'm missing. There we go. Well, I'll just freehand it. So this is from 1902. This is one of the instances in which, the Berwins were not actually well known for having such a wonderful environment for their domestic workers. This was a newspaper article that highlighted, of course, the Berwins walkout, their entire staff leaving the Elms, which was not the only walkout that took place in Newport that summer. But of course, this ended up being the national news. And we know that from various other references and resources that, again, this was not an uncommon, here we go. I want to make sure that I quoted some of these things because they're very important. We know that it was not necessarily an uncommon practice for people to stage walkouts. Because they had wonderful places to live, what they were actually complaining about was that they worked very, very hard, particularly that first season that the Berwins were trying to make a big grand impression with their new fancy house. They apparently worked 12 hours a day with no time off whatsoever because the Berwins were constantly entertaining. So that took quite a toll. We also know that from these types of articles, as well as articles like this, there is some things get sensationalized a little bit. In one case, they are overly exaggerating the Berwins and who they are as people, which we have factual evidence to contradict. And then you have things like this in 1865, where there's a lot of poking at, as Peggy discussed, the types of people that took on domestic service roles. So this calls it a kind of people, and that they were lazy, unappreciative, drunken, or thievish. It's a pretty broad blanket. And even in 1845, the Boston Census categorized servants as part of the, quote, unclassified residue of the population. So, interesting characteristic. But I think that what we can take away from stories like those of Julia and Nellie are that there are no typical experiences in the life of a woman, let alone an Irish woman, working in any domestic capacity. Louise McNeice observed, "It is never safe to generalize about the Irish." I think we see that here with the lives of these two sisters working at the Elms. The only commonality that we can really deduce is that immigrating to the US, working with intelligence offices and taking on such jobs were probably emotionally very, very grueling and very difficult. But it seems that the benefit outweighed the potential risk. And in Newport, because of the risks taken by Irish immigrants, like Julie and Nellie, the result of that risk is a vibrant community that has been made, that has significant contributions made to it in Newport's culture through every professional possibility, not just through domestic service. And I say that we're probably better off for the legacy that they have left than without it. So thank you very much. And I think we look forward to taking questions.
Questions for either of us?
Yes.
Yes.
Did the staff in Newport, did they go to New York in the winter, or were they separate staffs?
The question for those on Zoom is if staff would go back and forth to New York during the winter months. It wholly depends. The Berwins seem to have two very separate staffs, but depending on the family, it could have gone either way. There were also staffs that would go with them on travel and trips. So they could have at any time up to 27 people employed at various houses.
So as a follow-up, the staff worked 6 weeks. What did they do the rest of the year?
Well, there were other occupations in Newport to be had. Otherwise, they could have also migrated to other cities to do other things. You know, Newport was a vibrant full year community. And you know, for these specific women, I don't have an example of what they did because that information hasn't been shared. We can't identify it yet, but certainly there are restaurants to be worked in. There are other types of domestic work to be had that are probably a little less better paying, but there were certainly options for them. See this hand back here?
At least in the 1850s and 60s, when they were beginning to build large houses, the people from New York brought their staffs with them, and they rented houses for their staffs so that they could serve them in the comfortable way.
Right.
I have a question for Mark. I agree with you that the Irish women were very generous in giving away their monies, the church, to their families, but you missed something.
And what might that be?
And that was in 1843, when they had a repeal meeting here in Newport. The names of the people at the meeting were published in the Boston Pilot. The men are first, and the counties to which they came listed, and then you had the women. The women were probably one of the largest contributors to the fund of Rasa.
Well, you are correct. In fact, when the land war took place and you had Fanny Parnell came to the United States to collect money for the whole thing with the land war and stuff, the Irish domestics were among the great contributors to that. So yeah, it's not one of the things I touched on in this talk, but you are right that they were contributors not only to the political actions like that, but the land war. They were very important.
They were the biggest supporters of Irish nationalism.
Exactly.
They probably outpaced the men.
I don't know about that because I don't have the stats, but they certainly are important. Thank you. That's a good point to bring up. Yeah.
Was there any allowance for any of the Bridgets who might have become pregnant?
Oh, she's asking an interesting question. Was there any allowance for any of the Irish Bridgets who might have become pregnant? There were always stories that you read in some histories of domestic service that are rather salacious about sexual harassment of the women by the masters of the house and stuff. From what I've read about in the United States, it seems that that was not that it didn't happen, of course it must have, but it was not that common an occurrence among the Irish for some reason or other, that they did not have high rates of getting involved with the members of the master staff and so on. I'm sure it happened. I've read about a few cases myself of people going into an almshouse that said they were enceinte, which means pregnant in French. So, yeah. But apparently it was not that common among the Irish, for whatever reason.
And I guess likewise, as far as looking back to the African-American experience, I'm assuming that in terms of childcare, that none of these were nursing, you know, the children of the Anglos. I mean,
Oh, you mean we're talking about wet nurses? Is that what you mean? Okay, now the Irish domestics that I've studied, I didn't look at wet nurses at all, so I can't speak to that. Thank you. That's a good question. Sir?
Yes, my parents immigrated in the late 20s, and my aunt Mary, before her auntie, were played by Boston Brahmin. Auntie Mary was played by the Salt Stones, and they took very excellent care of her as she grew older. Paid for her stay at a retirement home in the South End, and she continued to receive a stipend, so to buy whatever she wanted.
They must have been good people. And as I said, employers are human beings. They ran the gamut from obviously exemplary people like those people to other people who would cast you on the street without a second thought. So yes, and I'm happy to hear about the good stories too, because it's unfair to cast all employers as if they were not good people. Some of them were excellent employers. Sir.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize the time, but Aunt Mary, she was employed by the Miss Allen. She was employed by the Allen family, and Miss Allen never married, and Aunt Mary eventually became her companion more than her maid. And Aunt Mary married the Allen family chauffeur. She became Mary Kennard. Albert Kennard was from South Carolina. He was a Southern Baptist. They were married outside the rail.
Oh, yes. For those of you who aren't Catholic, you know that back in the day, you had to get married in the rectory or something. If you married non-Catholic, it was tough times. Yeah, right. Well, you know, there were some stories too that I've heard of, some love stories too. There was a story that one man told me about his family, that he was a branch of an old Yankee family that was a Protestant family, but his family was Catholic because one branch of the family, the mother died and the father got a little Irish girl out of an orphanage to help with the children, and they fell in love. And it was a genuine love story, and he converted to Catholicism to marry her, and that branch is still, you know, Pendleton is their name. They're still a Catholic branch of the family. So, you know, in the human story, we have good, bad, and indifferent, depending on the actors in it. So thank you for that.
I just have two.
Oh, I don't know.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah.
Everyone hear me?
But my mother's friend, she was from Lewisburg, County Mayo. Her friend became a cook, surrogate mother to the Perini family. Now, I don't know, since you know the Perini family. They were obviously second, third generation Italians, made a fortune in the construction industry. And Lou eventually owned Podiatricians of Boston Bridge. But they, as I get it, transformation, an Irish cook for an Italian family, I thought it would be the other way around. and the last, the last one was Mary. My mother.
Don't go forgetting your mother.
The 1930 census has her as a domestic for Dr. Houlihan in Newport, Massachusetts. So you had the Irish by 1930.
Who had enough money to hire Irish.
To employ an Irish maid.
Yes, that became more common over time, that you would have a wealthy Irish family with, in fact, I interviewed the nanny of a family like that too. It's an Irish-American family. They employed this woman direct from Ireland. So that was common too. Good point. Okay, sir.
And one more being from Boston, I was struck by the name Leslie Jones. Are you any relation to the Boston Globe writer, Leslie Jones?
I'm from Missouri, so I'm a Cardinals fan. Yes.
Well, some of that extended into the late 40s and 50s. My mother worked for the original Norman people. My father died when I was young, and she had to go to work. And she was a Bridget all the way up until the 1950s.
Oh, yeah.
My mother too.
I don't mean to say that I used just a quick thing. I used the period for my study of 1840 to 1930 because after the Depression, the number of Irish who came to the United States went way down. It wasn't that there weren't any Irish domestics. The number decreased to such an extent that after 1930, Irish girls tended to go to England if they were going to leave the country rather than the US. That's what. So yes, I know into the 1950s because
she went to work at 7 o'clock in the morning and came home at 7 o'clock at night, served breakfast, lunch to all the help, and finally got home at 7 o'clock. This was in the late 70s and early.
a long, hard day. I interviewed another family.
$5 a month. She would have gotten a lot more today.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting because that's true. I interviewed a family whose mother did the same thing. Her husband died. She had to go back to work as a domestic servant. She had little girls to take care of. And they said their mother was smart. She made the employer pay for her car fare to and from work.
Thank you. We've got one over here.
There's one more to your right.
The Elms, Timothy Sullivan and his wife Julia Lynch.
Yes.
There was another Timothy Sullivan and his sister Julia who lived just a few blocks down the street on Belgium Avenue.
From what we can tell from records, no, they're not related. But trying to dig through census records as well as immigration records, it's a very common name. So we have a lot of duplicates. We have Timothy Sullivans and Julia Sullivans that are brother and sister. So it's easy to get confused, but again, there would have been many people by the same name living in this area because the population was so dense.
Jimmy the Woodworker.
Hello, I have a question.
Yes.
I lived in the Fifth Ward when we used to buy a house. I didn't live around here, but would a domestic still be called a domestic if they lived in the Fifth Ward? Because I heard stories the women would walk up from all the houses that looked the same up and down all her street, and the men would work outside. Would they be still called a domestic, and then they have to walk back and forth in just summer weather or winter weather?
So in Newport too, you know, I use the term domestic staff quite a lot in my presentation, but at the time they largely be called servants. So that distinction is more just contemporary distinction. The term servant was actually used to keep them in a class below other types of occupations. So that type of domestic versus not wouldn't have been familiar jargon at that time period.
I'm just curious about the Fifth Ward when they put all the houses up. Obviously, they have the same architect and they start to all look the same. So I was just curious when that came about.
Sure.
One last question. I'm going to pass this down to Rosemary Canfield.
Okay. I'm a docent at the Museum of Newport Irish History Interpretive Center, which is on J Street. In the summertime, we get lots of visitors, and many of them have stories connected to Newport, even though they're coming from out of state. And in the summer, we had a couple come in, and the lady said that her grandmother, but I think she meant her great-grandmother, had worked as a domestic in the breakers. And as the granny aged, and they asked the grandmother about her life in Newport, she kept referencing the 40 steps. And so as the family history got passed down and Granny passed away, this entire family thought that this poor woman spent her entire time going up and down 40 steps. So even the woman's husband said, my gosh, she worked so hard going up and down 40 steps. And she would talk about going up the 40 steps and down the 40 steps. Now, if you're in a house, you don't call stairs steps. So, you know, but I took her over to the wall where we have a lovely graphic picture of the 40 steps. And I explained it was the sigh of relief. Oh like of boys' hats. And they went away so grateful that they learned the distinction. Now, what I find ironic, and maybe Leslie can back this up, if you go into the breakers, because she thought that the grandmother worked at the breakers. When you go into the breakers in the Great Hall and you hang a right, and then you hang another right, and there's a staircase that takes you to the second level. There are 40 steps.
There are more than 40 steps in the breakers.
There's a landing, there's a 40, and then there's a landing.
On the staff side, there are far more than 40
Well,
steps.
that particular, I don't think the staff ever went up those stairs. But I've gone up and down enough times, and I started to count them. And I thought, there are 40 steps inside the house. But, my notation in our passed down log is sometimes you can't always believe what grandma tells you.
It's a good story.
Thank you, Rosemary. Before we close, and before I thank them, I would like to hit 2 slides here because they tie into, okay. Is that on the screen there? Yeah. Can you see it? Okay. Yeah, please. This is tonight's lecture is obviously going to, I believe, be a living lecture. There's a reason for that. Is we're very interested in hearing from the audience and the friends of the audience, if they in fact have other Bridget stories. We'd like them to at least pass it through us. We can get them to you. And there it is. Any ancestors or family members that worked at one of the Newport estates, we'd love to hear from you. And we will get that to the proper individuals.
Can I add on to that?
Please.
Even if they didn't work at one of the houses that we have under our custodianship, we'd love to hear any stories that go along with any of the Newport houses.
Thanks, Leslie. I didn't pass you your Congressional Medal of Honor, which is usually that's that comes from the Gaelic Cross at the Barney Street Cemetery.
Thank you.
And that's our logo. We wanted you to have that, and we can't thank you enough. I always have great takeaways, and the one tonight that I just did overlook was the inculcation of the manners and mores that helped the assimilation of the Irish. Great. Yeah, thanks to both of you.